Hello and welcome. I'm Rawia Alami and this is the Dailies, where we take a look at important news stories, reports, analysis and articles published in newspapers and media outlets across the world. News of the shooting and killing of 2 Israeli embassy staffers in Washington dominated the front pages of newspapers today, while the confrontation between President Trump and the South African president in the Oval Office received a lot of attention, especially in America. However, most media outlets continue to analyze and report on President Trump's changing position on the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. We'll start with Le Monde, whose editorial depicts the most recent change in the European position regarding the continuing war in Gaza, saying that the Israeli government must no longer act with impunity. Le Monde's editorial strongly criticized the Israeli government's actions in Gaza, arguing that its stated goals of destruction and depopulation amounts to policies outside the bounds of international human rights. It also highlights the deliberate use of hunger, mass bombings and forced displacement of Palestinians, warning these could be classified as genocide by international courts. The editorial calls out the international community's passive or complicit response, especially from countries that continue to support Israel unconditionally. While acknowledging Hamas's responsibility for the conflict, the article insists that the time has come for clear, decisive opposition to Netanyahu's extremist coalition and its annexationist agenda, urging Israel's allies to end their indulgence and hold the government accountable for its actions. More on the war in Gaza, as while many newspapers talked about President Trump's growing frustration with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, contending that Israel is getting increasingly more isolated, voices have risen inside Israel calling for a new Israeli strategy independent of the U.S. Eric Mandel, for one, wrote in the Jerusalem Post, reviewing the changing dynamics of the U.S.-Israeli relationship under President Trump's second term, emphasizing a shift from traditional alliance to a more contractional and transactional approach. The author, drawing on extensive discussions with policymakers and first-hand experience in Israel, argues that the Trump administration now prioritizes deals and financial interests over shared democratic values, as he says. Mandel also says that Israel finds itself increasingly sidelined as U.S. negotiates directly with regional actors like the Houthis and relaxes sanctions on adversaries as Syria. The article urges Israeli leaders to adapt by seeking new partnerships, especially with countries like India, and to prepare for more independent security strategies. The article concludes that while the U.S.-Israel bond remains important, Israel must now navigate a less reliable and more self-interested American foreign policy. Moving on, the New York Times published a news analysis reviewing President Trump's Oval Office meeting with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, where Trump repeatedly claimed white South Africans are being targeted and executed. Despite police statistics showing otherwise, also Trump's remarks echoing white supremacist talking points overshadowed Ramaphosa's calls for civility and accurate context about crime in South Africa. The analysis also highlights Trump's history of framing himself as a protector of white people, both in the U.S. and abroad, and notes his administration's recent moves to roll back diversity initiatives and civil rights oversight. Critics indeed condemned Trump's comments as racist and dangerous propaganda. The analysis concludes that Trump's focus on white victimhood continues to shape his domestic and international agenda. The stalled peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine received a lot of attention from the media. The Wall Street Journal published an exclusive report on its front page on President Trump's recent diplomatic efforts on the Ukraine war, focusing on his 2-hour call with President Vladimir Putin and subsequent conversations with European leaders. Trump acknowledged to European allies that Putin believes he is winning and is not ready for peace, a view Europeans already held but had not heard directly from Trump. The report highlights also how, despite earlier threats of new sanctions, Trump backed off and instead proposed lower-level peace talks at the Vatican, also signaling a reduced U.S. role in shifting responsibility to Europe and also Ukraine. The piece also cites European leaders who expressed disappointment, recognizing they must now take the lead in supporting Ukraine and pressuring Russia. The Vatican has shown interest in hosting talks, but prospects for real progress remain uncertain. The Europeans are certainly disappointed with the Americans when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, and that was evident in many opinion articles published in European newspapers today. Robert Clark wrote in The Telegraph saying President Trump is at risk of once more being outsmarted by Putin, and not for the first time in his second term. The article addresses Trump's shifting and increasingly passive approach to the Ukraine war, noting that after promising to end the conflict quickly, he has failed to secure a ceasefire and now appears to be stepping back from U.S. leadership on this issue. Despite a lengthy call with Putin, Trump apparently offered economic incentives rather than pressure, and ultimately told European and Ukrainian leaders that U.S. would not impose new sanctions or directly mediate further. The author highlights the disappointment and surprise of European leaders at as Trump's stance effectively leaves negotiations to Russia and Ukraine and grants Putin more leverage. The article concludes that this approach risks emboldening Putin, weakening Western unity and undermining support for Ukraine at a critical moment. President Trump's big, beautiful tax bill was the focus of some American newspapers today, with many saying it certainly is big, but most definitely not beautiful. The editorial board of the Washington Post held that opinion and went even further by saying that it might ruin America's finances. The editorial reviews the financial turmoil triggered by President Trump's fiscal agenda and the recent U.S. credit downgrade by Moody's. Despite alarm from markets and experts, Trump and House Republicans are advancing a massive tax and spending bill that would extend the 2017 tax cuts and new tax breaks as well, and increase spending, pushing deficits up to or by up to as much as $4 trillion over the next decade. Now, the national debt, the U.S. national debt, that is, already stands at $36 trillion and could reach historic highs, with interest payments consuming a growing share of government revenue. Critics argue the plan relies on unrealistic growth projections and fails to address the structural deficit, raising concerns about America's fiscal stability and global economic leadership. Martin Kettle wrote in his column in The Guardian asking whether 21st century Britain now is becoming an unsustainably divided house. The author draws a comparison between the UK today and the United States just before the Civil War and found striking similarities. The article reviews Britain's deepening political and economic divisions, questioning whether the UK is now as sustainably divided as Lincoln's house divided. It also highlights how devolution and also regional tensions, especially after recent local elections, have made the country more fragmented, and public trust in government has hit record lows. The focus is on Prime Minister Keir Starmer's Council of the Nations and Regions, an initiative meant to foster collaboration between the UK government, developed administrations and English mayors. While the Council's purpose and powers remain unclear, experts argue that genuine cooperation is essential for tackling national challenges. The article concludes that only through meaningful partnership can Britain hope to restore public confidence and address its growing internal divides. And we'll end with the Financial Times, where Peggy Hollinger published an article today asking about the dominance of Elon Musk's satellite over the battle for the future of global connectivity. She explains how Amazon and Chinese rivals are working hard to catch up. The article reviews the fierce global competition to dominate low Earth orbit satellite internet, focusing on Amazon's newest project, Kuiper, and SpaceX's Starlink. It details how Amazon's recent satellite launches marks its entry into a market led by Starlink, which already serves over 5 million customers in 125 countries and benefits from rapid low-cost launches. The rivalry also extends to other players like China's SpaceSail and the EU's Iris, with governments seeking sovereign control over digital infrastructure for economic and also security reasons. While Starlink's scale and speed give it a major lead, Kuiper leverages Amazon's vast resources and retail reach. The article predicts intense price wars and innovation, but also warns that this battle could reshape global connectivity and strain the satellite industry. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.